So Daniel, you're a reporter at the Huffington Post, and you have actually covered this race in Ilhan Omar's district, congressional district in Minnesota. She's facing a primary challenge from another Democrat. You know quite a bit about that, and what I wanted to talk about today is the fact that she recently put out a mailer, kind of hitting a few of his donors, pointing out that they were from Wall Street, they're from out of state, some are from New York. This was picked up in a Vice News article by Cameron Joseph, and Joseph pointed out that every single donor listed in the mailer is Jewish. And of course, Ilhan Omar has gotten into hot water before over comments around Israel, comments implying, some amount of influence from pro-Israel lobbies that obviously have upset a lot of Jewish folks. And so I think a lot of people looked at this and they said, hey, she's doing it again. She's making an allusion to Jews, to Jewish donors, so on and so forth. When I looked at it, I mean, it didn't really seem that way to me. It seemed like she had just listed some like really rich kind of Wall Street dudes who are giving to her opponent. It was incidental that they happened to be Jewish, but I don't think she necessarily called any attention to that. What was your understanding of this mailer and how it played out?
Yeah, so I should make clear, Zed, and I'm happy to be here, that I did not receive the mailer myself. I read about it in Vice News from the article that Cameron wrote, who I think is overall a terrific reporter, by the way. And basically Omar, who really has decided that Anton Melton-Meaux, the attorney challenging her effectively from the center left, sort of a more moderate figure than she is more vulnerable to criticism that he's receiving Wall Street cash, corporate cash from very well-heeled corporate executives, then underscoring the fact that at least some of those executives are doing so under the auspices of the pro-Israel lobby. But it's sometimes hard to discern. So, for example, the one name that I really focused on when I sort of commented about this on Twitter is Jonathan Gray. He's the president of the private equity firm Blackstone, which, among other things, is known for profiting from the practice of surprise medical billing, where they've invested in doctors' practices that are not covered by hospital insurance plans and profit from that. And they've also used those funds to fight efforts to reform that practice. And I've learned about him in that context, but nothing about his name or his identity or any of his sort of immediate characteristics, his bio on his website indicated to me that this is a Jewish person, or that I would intuitively know that this is a Jewish person. And yet the Vice News article lists three executives from the business and finance worlds who are featured in this mailer, two of whom have discernibly Jewish last names, and one of whom is Jonathan Gray. And in fact, the mailer got his name wrong and called him John Gray, John Gray, which is, John is, I mean, the whole activity that we're engaged in here is a bit ridiculous in terms of trying to discern somebody's identity. But if we're in that game, then it's worth noting that the spelling mistake that Omar's folks made Gray sound less Jewish, not more, because John is one of Jesus's apostles, and or is rather he's the author of one of the Gospels, I should say, and Jonathan is an Old Testament character. So the former is a very typical and common Christian name, and the latter is a typical and common Jewish name, though neither exclusively so.
Now, excuse my ignorance, but I think John Stewart, that's Jon. Would that be more common for it to be Jon if it was Jewish?
Absolutely. Jewish people are much more likely to be named Jon, which is invariably short for Jonathan. That's not to say there are no Jews named John, or that there are no non-Jews named Jonathan, but it's far less common. Now, so this is just presented that way, and then there's a fourth person mentioned in the Vice piece who's featured in the mailer, which is someone quoted anonymously, in other words, or just with his first name, who's a resident of the affluent Westchester town of Scarsdale, who told BuzzFeed why he was donating against Ilhan Omar, and and the way this piece is subtitled is 3 Jewish donors and a guy from Scarsdale named Michael. Scarsdale does have a very large Jewish population. I don't know the exact percentages, but this is thin. You know, that she ripped a headline and put it on a mailer that says, you know, Michael from Scarsdale, and we're supposed to assume that because Michael from Scarsdale and Seth Klarman and Stanley Weinstein and Jonathan Gray are the ones featured, you know, makes it as if she's insinuating something about Jews. Now, mind you, I don't even know if Seth, I mean, to me, I hear Seth Klarman, I'm familiar with his political activities. He's a prodigious sort of conservative pro-Israel donor and sort of a conservative never Trump Republican, for whatever that's worth, and had actually gave a ton of money to House Democrats to retake the House, but only as a anti-Trump move. I happen to know he's Jewish, you know, but again, not one that necessarily screams Jew. Stanley Weinstein, yeah, that's a very Jewish name, but again, we're playing a game here of that I think ironically makes the problem of anti-Semitism worse, because we're encouraging people to engage in a guessing game. A lot of people have last names or first names that do or don't sound Jewish. It reminds me of the ways in which sometimes people who have very light skin or have very, you know, are not necessarily immediately identified as Black, or vice versa. And so it kind of, it's a bit nauseating to me, this idea that we're supposed to intuitively understand that she's making this about Jews. There are no images presented that are disparaging or cartoonish. It's just a very classic left populist progressive type mailer slamming an opponent for taking money from top corporate executives. And I would add that the best part of the article is that Cameron Joseph, the author, spoke to Stanley Weinstein, the retired real estate executive from Miami Beach, who cut checks to Melton-Meaux, Omar's challenger. And it's the kicker quote. And he basically said, well, of course I think she's anti-Semitic. It's a huge part of why I'm giving to her opponent. But no, I don't think the mailer is anti-Semitic. So one of the most sort of apparent, the person whose Jewishness is most apparent in this supposedly offensive Ilhan Omar mailer is also not offended. And that struck me as a pretty funny irony.
Yeah, that is funny. And you know, I guess one thing I would think about this is that I was kind of like looking at the discussion about this on social media, and I think some people said, you know, maybe they didn't necessarily think it was intentionally like anti-Semitic or anything, but they said, well, given her history or her context, should her campaign team have gone through and like found a big donor who wasn't Jewish or something and decided to put them on there? And the thought that crossed my mind when I saw that was that it probably is true that the biggest donors who are giving against her are Jewish because they tend to be more affiliated with pro-Israel causes. She's very much on the other side of them on Israel issues. So they are Jewish, but it's not necessarily about them being Jewish. Are there like really large donors that are like, I don't know, Christian or secular or something that could have also been on this mailer, or is it just a fact that like the biggest donors in this case happen to be Jewish, primarily because of the interest in the pro-Israel community that's taken an interest in this race?
Yeah, no, I should be clear. You know, I haven't spoken to, for, you know, I think that there are also Jewish people who happen to be in the finance world who have taken an interest in seeing her off. And look, I think it's a reality that obviously the Jewish community of Metro New York is the largest Jewish community in the country. Finance is a very big industry here, if for no other reason than geographic proximity. There are a lot of Jewish people in the financial industry who have politics that are at odds with Omar. I think that you can make that tactical critique that she should be held to an extra high standard. Personally, I still wouldn't have written this story. You know, I just don't think that because someone made mistakes in the past that the press or needs to indulge every one of these kinds of sort of politically motivated attacks. And I would also add, to answer your question directly, I've combed through his FEC filings myself. I've combed through his campaign disclosure forms. And there are a number of top executives of major Fortune 500 corporations, including the former CEO of General Mills, a massive food company based in the Twin Cities, that have maxed out to him. There are a number of similar figures from the corporate world like that. Now, General Mills, which I feel like is best known for making cereal, is not necessarily as easy to paint as a villain, and there hadn't been secondary reporting on it yet. That this is not something that was in an article, but so yeah. I mean, I suppose that they could have done their own Jew counting of sorts, and sort of endeavor to find out the ethno-religious identity of each of these people that they were featuring. But maybe the fact that they did not speaks more to their tolerance and lack of prejudice than it does to any prejudice. So speaking in a capacity, if I may, as a Jewish person, I really prefer the mode of people not doing the Jew counting. And we could also talk about, and I want to give you a chance to introduce this, but the ways in which this might be a spillover effect from some of the other currents that are out there floating around in contemporary liberal and leftist discourse.
It's interesting because I worked for a candidate last year in a DA race, and that candidate was backed by George Soros, right? And Soros gave us they spent like hundreds of thousands of dollars on like basically IE cash supporting her. He supports many progressive-minded district attorney candidates, reform, civil libertarian type people. And I think our opponent raised this issue of okay, well, Soros is spending too much money. He's not from around here, so on and so forth. And I think some people instantly interpreted that as well, this is they're raising that issue because he's Jewish. Well, not really. I mean, he was spending so much money that he was out fundraising the rest of the campaigns. He was a major factor, and I think you can't just ignore that because it suggests
it's fair game politically, right?
Yeah, it's fair game. I mean, it's that I guess there is a trope that Jews are all powerful, they all have money, they're all bankers, they're all obsessed with Israel, blah, blah, blah. I guess it would be wrong if you implied that anybody who's Jewish has those characteristics, right? But it's also true that there are some Jewish people who work on Wall Street, and it is just a fact that some of those people donated against Ilhan Omar. And that might be just as much because she tends to be on the left-wing edge on economic issues. She wants to tax Wall Street a lot more. She wants to break up banks and things like that. And because of all that, they have just as much of as an incentive to donate against her. It just happens to be factually true. I think it would be going too far if people were calling into question their religion or their ethnicity or pointing to them being Jewish, or if they imply that all Jewish people hold those views. I think that would be certainly sliding into prejudice. But I don't think that just because you can find an example where someone actually is, they work on Wall Street, they do happen to be quite supportive of Israel, and they're giving against Ilhan Omar. I mean, those are just a set of facts, right? That's nothing that's being imputed. It's not, and I think you're right. It does go to some other trends out there.
And again, they do not mention these people's faiths or their ethnicity or make any insinuation in this piece of campaign literature about their personal backgrounds. That is being grafted on, frankly, not just by Vice, but by a local Twin Cities rabbi who has now endorsed Melton-Meaux. I know him, Rabbi Avi Olitsky. He's a guy I respect. I happen to disagree with him on this, but I also happen to know that he's on the National Council of AIPAC, and he's had his issues with Omar in the past. And I spoke to him for an article about pro-Israel donors bundling money for Melton-Meaux, and he basically served in a capacity to just say, look, I don't see eye to eye with Omar, but I've worked with her in her office amicably. He has since that time, this was either at the end of June or early July that I wrote that piece. He has since that time publicly endorsed Melton-Meaux. And of course, the entire story really hangs on his criticism and on a Democratic strategist speaking anonymously who says that Omar should have found a way to mention somebody non-Jewish in the mailer. Again, anonymous. Now, I think that, you know, just to get to what you were saying about Soros, I think it's important that there be clear rules, right? And that people know into what system of social norms they are entering and being asked to play. So I think it's relatively clear. If you depict George Soros with stereotypically Jewish features, a large nose, rubbing his hands together, money, a puppet master controlling things, yeah, that probably veers into anti-Semitism, and sometimes just the way his name is uttered as an epithet. And that's a Jewish billionaire who supports causes on the left, and I think the same could be true of people who are very publicly known to be Jewish who support causes on the right. But I will say that
Sheldon Adelson may be an example of
a great
on that side.
example, right?
Right.
Another a billionaire figure who happens to be Jewish, and in fact, Adelson even more so because, you know, his hobby horse is kind of hawkish Israeli pro-Israel policies. I mean, really hawkish, and so. But the other piece of this, though, is just that in terms of depictions here, in terms of things that are being insinuated, I mean, just when you are literally in a situation where you do not know these donors' identities, that matters. In the interest of consistency in the way that I look at this and have sought to encourage people to use the benefit of the doubt when discussing questions of potential anti-Jewish bias of any kind, I will say that I did not agree with the people that pounced all over Kevin McCarthy for saying that it was, what was it, Soros, Steyer, and some other figure like with some Jewish ancestry donating to Democrats, because I didn't even know Steyer was Jewish, and it just struck me as, oh, this is a group of 3 prominent Democratic donors. You know, and so the left likes to play that game too. And I think, without getting into it too much because it's such a sensitive topic, and it's not something that I focus on, in general, the left often sort of sometimes construes things as discrimination when they may just be bad ideas or policy disagreements. And I think in the Trump era, when it comes to anti-Semitism, they've sometimes been quick to do that. And I think this is maybe a lesson about being a little bit more careful with that, because once it's unleashed as a viable political tool, or reified or validated, assuming it's already been in the political atmosphere, it will invariably or very likely be turned against the left.
And I think is particularly with some of these Middle East issues that come up, that Ilhan Omar, she's on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, she's heavily involved in them in terms of legislating. I think people are involved in using these accusations quite a bit against each other. I think that, for instance, the State Department has tried to create a definition of anti-Semitism that could include like singling Israel out, right? In which, like, whatever you think about that, like, there would be reasons someone might do that that would not be motivated by any kind of prejudice against Jews, but maybe they're still doing that just because, I don't know, they're making a particular geopolitical argument, or even they maybe just happen to have an interest in the Middle East conflict that they don't have in other conflicts. There are, the wider kind of issue that she ends up legislating around is so fraught with these kind of topics. And, I imagine that a lot of the people you talk to who are giving money to Melton-Meaux, who are part of this election campaign trying to get rid of her, maybe they don't think she's quite anti-Semitic in the, like, she hates Jews kind of way, but they think that maybe her view on Israel-Palestine is it's just threatening the Jewish people because of their conception of solidarity with Jewish people means supporting the current U.S. policy towards Israel, which is fairly supportive of the government offering military aid. Ilhan Omar is against that military aid. So there's also kind of an issue here, like you said there should be clear rules. I don't know that there are clear rules. I feel like there's almost irreconcilable views about this sometimes when we're talking about Israel-Palestine. Like people think of the other side as just there's no way they can come to any kind of agreement or compromise with them.
Yes, and I think that's all the more reason that journalists should be vigilant and people who self-identify as members of the left should be careful and vigilant about the way they themselves sort of level these claims. I'm not saying that it would diminish the appetite for them on the right, but I think it would provide firmer ground to stand on if the left were to accuse the right of violating universal norms that the left hopes to encourage and uphold. And I think you talk about this issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and obviously there are people for whom any sort of effort to criticize the Israeli government or increase US pressure on the Israeli government in the form of, let's say, stronger conditions on US aid or reconciliation with the government of Iran or some kind of diplomatic relations even are anti-Semitic by virtue of the fact that they are singling Israel out among a family of nations that includes dozens of human rights abusers, including our own government in many respects. But obviously, as you note, the U.S. has an ally and benefactor relationship with Israel that might give Americans a deeper interest in the policies of that government and a government that it financially and diplomatically supports. And I think, in addition, so obviously there are people that are very angry at her policies. Let's talk about just briefly her comments and the backstory there, which is that basically three main incidents. In 2012, she tweeted, "Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel." And then once she entered Congress in 2019, within a month or two, she had said two things that people really perceived as anti-Semitic, including many liberals, which were that when asked on Twitter why House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy was going to censure her and Rashida Tlaib for their pro-Palestinian views, she said, "It's all about the Benjamins, baby," which is a rap lyric that refers to $100 bills that are imprinted with Benjamin Franklin, and that was seen as a reference to Jewish money in politics. And within a matter of a few weeks, she was also speaking to a pro-Palestinian audience in DC and saying,
so I want to talk about the political influence in this country that says it is okay for people to push for allegiance to a foreign country.
And that was apparently a reference to Israel. So she certainly apologized for the tweet and the Benjamins incident, and she sought to clear the air on that latter incident. And I can see why people would not trust her, that these comments might be the tip of the iceberg on something more deep-seated. And I can see why people on the left who put a higher premium on a more robust U.S. policy toward improving the lives and political future of Palestinians are weigh those two things and go with with their concern for the Palestinians and her outspokenness about that. So all of those are very legitimate, I think, things. Not even if she apologized and you think that it reflects something deeper, or you just don't trust her anymore, that's normal politics, right? If you do not want a single member of the United States House to have a more activist approach toward pressuring the Israeli government when it comes to ending its 50-plus year occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, then that's your approach, and that those are legitimate policy stances. If you're one of the many people in the district who just wants somebody a bit more moderate, who plays nice with other members of Congress, that's also legitimate. And but I think that this mailer business, personally, goes too far.
Yeah, and I think ultimately it would be really interesting to see what happens in this race. What is your sense on the competitiveness of this particular race? Is it going to be close, or do you think it's any, you know, it's something where most incumbents are never really threatened? So it may be that Omar just walks away with it, but
We'll certainly find out. The primary is on August 11th. We have an internal poll that Omar released showing that she's up by more than 30 percentage points. Obviously, internal polls have their limits, but I will say that Melton-Meaux now has $1 million more in cash on hand than Omar does. And there is a supportive super PAC spending $500,000, a pro-Israel super PAC, spending $500,000 blasting her on the television airwaves, and they're not yet up on TV. So I would say it's in the mix. Now, there are a lot of things that she still has going for her, including the unanimous support of the kind of local Democratic establishment and organized labor community. And I think a very excited and energized activist base, and of course, name recognition. So, but it's important for people to realize this is an unusual district and she's an unusual member. She's somebody who won her primary 2 years ago with a plurality, not a majority. It was a very crowded field. And of course, you know, it's a heavily Democratic district, so she romped in the general election. But it's about, I believe, 30 or 40% Black. It's not majority minority. And, you know, it includes the city of Minneapolis, but also Minneapolis's northern and western suburbs. And, you know, the historic heart of Minnesota's Jewish community in towns like St. Louis Park. Obviously, she has Jewish support on the left. She has, you know, more than 100 of her Jewish constituents signed a public letter of support. But, you know, this may be, and I should say the district went for Bernie Sanders in this on Super Tuesday. So this is a district that leans left. I have not yet been out there, but I'm willing to bet that there are nonetheless some likely more affluent, but not exclusively more affluent liberals who just want to change. And, you know, I have spoken to some of those folks, and I think it's something to watch. And I think the stakes are high for either side.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, I think as we watch this race, we'll definitely keep your analysis in mind. I encourage everyone to go to Huffington Post and read Daniel's article about this. It's very, very detailed. And I think he really gets at a lot of the dynamics and what's happening in this race.
Yeah, we should make clear that that's an article about sort of the pro-Israel support for her challenger that came out a few weeks ago. I have not written about the mailer specifically, and I have something forthcoming about Melton-Meux's ties to an anti-union law firm.
Well, there we go. Yeah, Daniel's on top of it.